good on your end then. Just in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and jump right in. Okay.
Okay, well, let me
All right.
share here.
Sure. No worries. Um, so let me kick things off. Welcome everybody to the second to last week of term, which is just amazing. The Colloquium series and the research series are winding down, but the research in a lot of ways is winding up because there's so many fantastic events coming up here. Of course, starting with Rick's talk today, with I probably introduce in just a second. But just as a quick reminder, we have another great research series presentation on Wednesday as well. And this one is going to feature Jordan Linton from anthropology. That's going to be wonderful. And as a special reminder, Thursday, recall, is this unveiling of Lynn's statue on campus. And remember, there's both in-person and virtual options to attend that, but you do have to RSVP in advance either way. So we can either keep track of physical attendance or that you get the link. So if you haven't already, I'd really encourage you to do that. We will be having a follow-up event in the spring as kind of the weather and public health allows. That's going to be a bit more workshop focused in particular. We're looking forward to that. That's going to be a lot of fun. We didn't get to have a start of year barbecue or anything like that. So we're hoping by that point, kind of late spring, we'll be able to do some of the socialization that we've lost out on over the course of this year. Because it's a new day in 2021 in a lot of ways. So it's really good seeing all of you. Thanks again for joining. We have Rick joining us today, Rick Harbaugh, the professor from the Kelley School of Business, affiliated, of course, with economics in the business economics and public policy program at Kelley, but of course across campus too. Done a lot of interesting work, including today speaking on Subversive Conversations. And I love that title, Rick. Just fantastic. So we'll be hearing from Rick, as we said, for the next kind of 15, 20 minutes-ish. And per usual, if you have comments, questions, feel free to use the raise hand feature or enter them in the chat there, and I'll do my best to keep the queue after Rick's done. So thanks so much again for joining us, Rick. And without further ado, over to you.
All right, well, thanks, Scott. I did sneak into the office. I didn't want to fight it out with my kids over the Wi-Fi and everything. That was not going to be a winning battle. So here I am. So hopefully it should be a decent connection for everyone. Thanks so much for letting me speak in the workshop. I don't think I did it once before. Like I think it was more than 10 years ago. So my research is not that directly connected. We all bask in the glow, of course, of Lynn Ostrom's research here at IU, economists and everybody. But I feel like I regret not having been more participative. But I'm certainly going to go see the statue unveiling. There's no question I'm missing that. Thanks again for letting me speak about this. I hope it's going to be considered a little bit relevant for people. So I'm not. We'll find out. Okay. Good. So this is a joint paper, of course, with Orchishman Chakraborty, who I do a lot of work together on, and also with who's at Yeshiva University, and Nemanja Antic, who's at Northwestern, I think at Kellogg. So they've zoomed all over the world presenting this thing. I presented it once in early version, and this is my first presentation since it's sort of come together. And it's also my first Zoom talk. So if it goes as poorly as my Zoom classes are going right now, it's not going to be a fun experience. So hopefully we can avoid that. Okay, so jumping right in here. We're thinking about modeling some situations that are hopefully of interest to people. Thinking about situations where people need to share some information in order to make a decision, which is pretty common, obviously. So maybe some scientists, they have some different expertise, and they need to talk to each other to figure out what's a good policy, okay? And how serious is the problem? What dimensions is it? More serious, less serious, other dimensions? Think about maybe committee members for a department making a hiring choice. They have read different letters, they've talked to different people, whatever, they have different expertise on teaching, on research, whatever it may be, and they need to talk to each other to make a decision. Firms considering a merger, hopefully there's some cost savings. They need to figure out how much they are, they need to talk. Think about maybe getting a little closer to the subversive title, which maybe is a bit oversold, I don't know. Think about some activists, they're trying to push for a new policy. And they need to figure out, is it really worth a hard push or not? So they need to talk to each other about how serious the situation is. Or getting a little bit more current here, two roommates, how safe have they been? They're thinking about having some friends over. Does it make sense or not? They need to talk to each other about, what they've been doing and stuff, right? Don't want to make it seem like just the college students who are doing that. Everyone's, of course, in that situation. And so pretty general, lots of things like this. Getting a little bit more specific to what we'll be thinking about, we'll be thinking about where there's not just this coordination need, but a bit of a concealment need also. Okay, so think about this scientist. They're going to be making recommendations to a public who might, care more about the immediate short-term economic cost of climate mitigation. Think about that hiring committee. The department might want to secure a hire for themselves this year before it disappears, but the dean might have a higher bar because they could give that to another department, right? So they might not want the dean to know everything they talked about in that committee meeting as they sort of fleshed out the different strengths and weaknesses of this candidate, right? They came to a conclusion, but they don't want to know how exactly it was made, okay? Antitrust officials, obviously, they care not just about cost savings, but also about probable increased market power and higher prices. So they'd like to know exactly what those guys are talking about, but those guys don't want to reveal everything. The activists, whatever, the status quo is preferred a bit more so by the other people, officials and such. So unless they think it's really serious, they're not going to maybe want to push it. And of course, there might be a third roommate here who has a higher standard. And if you start talking about things that you think are going to figure it out and maybe not so bad, well, for them that might be a problem. Okay, so situations where you need to coordinate and you need to conceal are what we're generally thinking about. Okay, so how are we going to reconcile these conflicting goals, right? You want to share enough information to successfully coordinate, but you also want to conceal enough information to keep interference by some other players from messing things up. And we're going to keep that a little bit loose because it's going to be very general. We just don't want somebody else who can impose some cost on these players if they find out exactly what the true information is, right? Because they have different preferences, and sometimes they're going to have some disagreement. And we'll see that more exactly. So out of this question, we hope to get insights into things that maybe are a little bit relevant for the Ostrom, workshop agenda generally, and specifically maybe even for some cybersecurity angle on it, perhaps. So we really appreciate feedback on this. So when does decentralization of information not hurt the players? So they're going to be communicating. Why? Because information is decentralized. And so if they were, one person knew everything, there would be no worries. They could just make a decision themselves, and there's no danger of their people finding out what they were thinking in their head, right? So this decentral of information is the problem, okay? But when is it not such a bad problem? When can we get around it? And similarly, you could think about if there was completely secure communication between everybody, right? There's no leaks, there's no hacks, there's no lawsuits, there's nobody who turns against you, whatever. Then also you wouldn't have to worry about the people finding out information. Okay, so I think it has some insight to two of these things. We've sort of gone back and forth on what angles to pursue. We presented at NSF Decentralization Conference because it has that angle. There are computer scientists there. I didn't really get any much feedback though on the computer science side of things, but we do think the second angle is very relevant. So anyway, we'll see. Okay, so our angle is going to be, we're going to have subversive is going to be basically you get what you want, and even if it's against the interest of the public or the boss or whatever this third party is, okay? So that's our definition of subversive. You get what you want even if it's against their interest. And the conversation is going to get that, it's going to have to be real back and forth, okay? So we're going to be thinking about communication. It's going to be a conversation, which is relatively unusual in the literature, but the communication itself is going to be cheap talk, okay? And that's not a very good advertising for communication models. Crawford and Sobel, strategic information transmission, they tried to call it, but then someone called it cheap talk, and that was it. So this is communication that's not costly signaling, like you might think of Spence's nice model of showing off, of virtue signaling, of all the different things that people do to reveal information about themselves, and it's credible because it's a little bit difficult. It's not going to be like a disclosure game like Milgram, who just got the Nobel Prize for partly this stuff, where what you say has to be true, but maybe you won't tell everything. Okay, you can hide stuff, but if you say it, it has to be true. It's not going to be mechanism design. Meyerson gave a talk on the workshop a few years ago, I recall, and famous for that, of course. And it's not going to be the very, very current hot topic of information design, where you design what you learn before you play the game, or the distribution of that information, which might facilitate communication, make it more persuasive. Okay, so it's going to be pure cheap talk. That doesn't sound like really promising. You'll see it's actually not a big deal. Generally, most of my research, embarrassingly enough, is on cheap talk. And we find that it is, it's a lot more powerful than people tend to think of it being. So I'm trying to move just 1 second, play my screen here for a second. There we go. Whoever I'm looking at now is in the center rather than off to the side. Cheap talk can be pretty persuasive. Think about you're driving down the highway, you see a sign, and it says, "World's best hot dogs." Okay? That's pure cheap talk. It's puffery in the advertising lingo. Okay? Is it credible? Well, people would say no, but I would say, hey, that tells you something. World's best hot dog says, don't eat the hamburgers. Okay, so if you like hot dogs, give it a try. If you like hamburgers, keep driving till you see that world's best hamburger sign. Okay, so this sort of just everyday communication where it's just like saying something actually has a lot of more room for credibility, as I think that example highlights, extreme example, than people usually talk about. So that's my focus has been within this cheap talk literature. What we're doing today, we're going to model as cheap talk, but we could also actually model it as verifiable disclosure as well, and it would still work. Okay, so players can take turns revealing some of their information. Every time you reveal a bit of your information, that's going to provide a context, which makes it a little bit easier for the other side to reveal information and not get in trouble with the outsider. Okay? Or maybe it's enough information for them to go ahead and make a recommendation, accept this plan or reject this plan. And the two people communicating, we're going to assume their interests are fully aligned. So if one side decides, yeah, I've heard enough, well, that's good for the other side too. Okay? But they have to make sure that if this outside party is listening, that they haven't revealed too much and they won't be punished in some way or maybe even the whole thing vetoed or whatever it may be. Okay? So that's our goal here. And let's just jump in and think of an example. Okay? So we got these two managers. They're thinking about a mining project. It's got benefits, it's got costs. So the benefits, I guess, are more economic and the costs, they are environmental. Okay, so one manager knows the benefits that are economics here, say, and the other knows the cost, the environmental cost. And if we're down in this region right here, the bottom right, the benefits are high, the costs are low. The managers are like, great idea, they're for it. Okay, up here, low benefit, high cost, they're both against it. Okay, no disagreement amongst the managers. It's just, is it, high benefits, low cost, or high cost, low benefits? Okay, so blue is they definitely agree on it. Red is they're definitely against it. Now the public, okay, they oppose everything that has high cost and relatively low benefits. And even if the costs are just equal to the benefits in this example, the public is against it. However, the managers are for it. So the managers are for everything that is in this blue, these three blue squares here, and the managers are also for these ones which are, just borderline. But the public is against the borderline cases. Okay, so we have a conflict of interest. It's not an extreme conflict of interest because the public and the managers agree here. The public and the managers agree here. They only disagree in these three regions here. Okay, so the managers, they need to have a conversation, decide what to do. No one manager has enough information to decide whether they're in blue-yellow region or red region. Okay. So they need to communicate, but again, they have to worry about revealing too much to outsiders. Okay, so you can see a key area to concern about is this low benefit case, thinking out the perspective of manager one. If they were just come out and say, hey, it's low benefit, well, from the perspective of the public, the deal is over. Okay, they do not want it. Even if it's low cost also, they're against this project. Okay, so they need to sort of basically sneak past this project, okay, and get it accepted, even though if it's low benefit, the public is always against it. Okay, so that's where we're going to have to come in with this conversation. That's going to go a little bit back and forth, reveal some more information as we go. Okay, we all good on this? Okay, my co-authors, they're the more high theory people, and I'm the more like play with the example person. So I've been playing with this, and I hope it's a decent example at least. Okay, so we're going to have what we call a conversation tree here. And starting just where we were right before. So again, blue is great. Everyone agrees, managers and the public. Red, managers and the public don't want this project. Conflict zone is this yellow region. So let's suppose manager one goes first. We could do it either way. And let's suppose the benefit is 1/2. It's just this kind of mediocre economic benefit. So they then just say it. Okay, now you look at this and probably the project is bad, right? Because from the perspective of the public, because it's either high cost, don't want it, medium cost, public doesn't want it, but the managers do, or low cost in which both the managers and the public do want it. Okay, so it's looking kind of bad. However, the public knows that the managers will never approve a project which is only a little bit of benefit and very high cost up here. So they're not too worried about it. Okay, so if they hear this, they have no reason to really get too upset, and the conversation is allowed to proceed. Okay, another way to think about it is that this was leaked after the fact and people went back and saw what was said. Saying this is not going to get them in trouble. Now manager 2 is going to have their chance to say something. If in fact it is high cost up here, they're going to say reject it. Okay. The other manager, upon hearing that, they agree, and of course the public agrees as well. They trust the managers to reject. They only trust the managers when they're trying to push something that might not be good. Or if it's either medium cost or low cost, then they just say accept. Okay, so they say accept the project. Manager 1, they're going to agree with it, not knowing whether it is truly in the yellow zone or the blue zone. Is it truly, a mediocre project or a good project? So they say accept, and the public also is left in the dark. They don't know. So therefore, they've managed to sneak past this mediocre project, determine that it's worthwhile to pursue. It's not a red one. They've determined it's worthwhile to pursue, but the public still doesn't know whether it's mediocre or good. Okay, so they are subversive. Now let's suppose we're down here where it's not 1/2. It could be either 0 or it could be 1. Let's suppose then that manager 1 here, upon hearing this, they're just going to say, well, your turn. What do you think? Or, which basically means they're not going to say this, or effectively they literally, I suppose, could say the benefit is 0 or the benefit is 1. At that point, right, they've basically pooled, in the lingo, these states here and these states here. Is it 0 or is it 1? The public doesn't know, and nor does the second manager. So the manager 2 now, they hear this, knowing that it's either in these two areas, and they say either it's, cost half, medium cost or high cost, or they say just accept. Okay, so if it's a low cost, they're just going to say it's either yellow or blue. For them, they're just going to say accept. And at that point, that's good enough for the other manager, and it's also good enough for the public. The public now, they've pooled together this yellow and the blue. The public isn't really sure whether in fact it's a mediocre project, but they have no reason to reject it. If it's higher cost, we're saying then they would just say it's cost 1/2 or 1. At that point, it could be in this region, could be in this region. It bounces back to player 1's turn, and they make the decision to reject or to accept, basically whether it's reject here or accept here. And when they accept, everyone's happy with that. The public is still a little suspicious, but they have no reason to think it's probably bad. So at that point, they've managed to get all of the conversations over, and they've gotten all of these conflicting zones accepted. And so we say it's subversive. They got exactly what they want. In every situation where they wanted it to be rejected, they were able to figure out that it's no good and got it rejected. That was the coordination. And in every situation where they wanted it accepted, even when the public did not, they got it accepted, and that's our subversion. Okay? So it was necessary for a conversation back and forth to do that. Okay, so that's kind of our main little example there. Is there any quick questions about the example, or I'd be violating rules by asking for any quick questions?
That's okay. Yeah, we usually hold them for the end, but it's fine if there's any clarifying questions or any comments so far. Seeing none so far, Rick, I think you're good to proceed.
Okay, someone could raise a hand, then that would pop up, I think, right? Or you'll see that if I don't. Good.
Yes, for sure. That's great.
Okay, so that's just our basic idea here, and then it, being a paper, you have to generalize it a bit and make it overly complicated and stuff. So then we do that and play that. That's where the signaling game comes in. And so what we look at is maybe we should have kept it discrete types. We often wonder that, but we jumped in and we did this continuum case here where the benefit is from 0 to 1, the cost is from 0 to 1. Okay. And that conflict zone now depends upon this cutoff right here. C, it could be like there's down here, there's a small conflict. Could be up here, there's a large conflict. We can vary that. Okay, so now more generally, we're trying to get all these Y and blue regions snuck past the public, right? While also identifying all these bad regions and definitely rejecting them. So both that coordination and concealment. So just being a little bit more exact here, we're going to say that they get a positive payoff if they accept a project that's in these yellow or blue regions where x minus y plus c is greater than 0, and they get a negative payoff if they mistakenly do it and they're the wrong way. And this c is going to be our conflict parameter. It could be pretty high conflict up here or pretty small conflict down here. So we've already said that, who prefers what, so it's exactly the same as example, so that's pretty straightforward. Now we have to keep the public happy. We're calling them public, the observer in this case. Again, we're keeping pretty general about it because we're just saying if there's any cost they can impose on these guys, that's a problem. So it could be the public gets angry and has an investigation. It could be there's a boss who stops it. It could be vetoed, whatever it may be. Okay, so the observer. To keep them happy, it has to be that given any message which is sent, the probability that's in this acceptance region is bigger than the probability that's in the conflict region. So anytime during this conversation, it must be that the odds are still good that it's a good project. Okay. So how are we going to do that? We spent I don't know, a year thinking of all sorts of various insane ways that this might or might not be possible. And then we finally converged actually on a conversation that looked pretty much exactly like that example. Okay. So in that example, we only had 3 types. But do you remember we pooled those outside types, the 0 and the 1? Player 1 went first, and they said, it could be hello, it could be hi. I'm not going to say, right? So we're going to do the same thing. For every state here by player known by player 1, they're going to pool together it and its opposite higher. So if it's a 0, they pull in with a 1. If it's a 1/3, they pull in with a 2/3. Okay? So whatever it may be, the first stage of the conversation is X says, yeah, it's high or it's low, and more specifically in this case, 1/3 or it's 2/3. At that point, we're down to these 2 lines here, a little broader than reality. And then the second message could be that they reveal exactly the true state. And I'm not showing all the branches here because it's getting a little complicated. And once they do that, that's actually going to be good enough information for player 1 to come back and make a decision. Okay? So if it was in this region here, the cost, we're just going to go player 1 moves, player 2 says something, and then player 1 can make a decision. Okay? Otherwise, they're going to pass it back to player 1 in the conversation. Comes back to player 1. Player 1 now, pretty similarly to what we saw in our tree from before, they're going to say the truth now. Is it 1/3 or is it 2/3? Before they're being cagey about it. Like, what do you think? Now they're going to tell you what they think, okay? Now at that point, they've gotten rid of a lot of this interior yellow region, so it's safe to say it's not that great. It's safe to say that's not that great because these guys, if it were in that danger region here, they would have revealed the true state. And it would have been pooled with a very good state over here, so that was also safe. So now they can safely admit it's not that great, okay, and still have a pretty good chance that it'll be, good, okay? So they reveal that, and then in message 4 by the second player, if the costs are high, they, and we're on this left one here, then they're just going to reject it, and if we're in the left column down here, they're going to accept it, whereas if they're in the right column, now they're going to depend upon whether they reject or whether they accept. But when they say accepting, they're pooling just a little bit of yellow here, not too much yellow, with this blue. And so again, everyone's like, oh, okay. And so we've managed in this particular example of getting all of the red states rejected and all of the blue and yellow states accepted. And that exact same logic applies to every single pair along here. So we've managed to completely coordinate while also concealing what we need to do. Okay, so it turns out it's a pretty simple protocol. I'm burning through some time here. So we do have some sort of theorems and stuff for the econ paper. We say that find that a subversive conversation always requires 3 rounds. Okay, so it's a true conversation. Previous economics papers where there's been some conversations have been sort of one, not a real back and forth. Just someone says something, someone says something else. Here it's really got to go back a little bit. Any universal conversation requires at least 4 rounds. Universal is very grand sounding. All it says is that it's going to work for any value of the conflict, the exact same conversation. So it doesn't have to be some super tailored, fine detail. I don't believe it could ever happen conversation. Any sort of conversation of that form is going to work independent of the fine details, but it'll require at least 4 rounds in order for it to work. The one we just showed you before that is the fastest universal subversive conversation. And again, it looks very simple, and we just went off in so many crazy directions before we ever found that. So we're kind of happy about it. And it's also a fine conversation. Okay, so then we just extend it some different areas. We look at some nonlinear preferences. We look at maybe the bias is reversed, so the public actually cares the opposite direction a little bit more strongly. We think about where the conflict might instead maybe be, the public is against the project, but now they're actually biased towards the project for high enough levels of the benefits and stuff. And we are able to, we find that these subversive conversations continue to work, and they must indeed be conversations, and they have to have, there's a minimum number of rounds that we talked about. Then we apply it to thinking about situations where it's not a nice little square and stuff. There might be an unfavorable kind of prior where a lot of red up here, and we're able to use a very similar conversation. It might be that the distributions are not nice and uniform, which is what we started out with, and we deal with that. It might be that the observer is biased against things. We can deal with that. You can see in this situation we start having as much blue as yellow. It starts to get tight down here, so it gets a little complicated. We can deal with that, and we can deal with thinking about not just the probabilities of being a good project or bad project, but there being true expectations and stuff, expected values, for instance, which is kind of like the intro example. So anyway, we kind of find some good stuff, but we also find doesn't always work, of course. So the main thing we're doing now is trying to figure out what are the limits of subversion, okay? When can we show it really doesn't work? And that's what people are pushing us to do. It's kind of crazy. I don't know if we're going to get what they want. So here's a case here. Subversion's impossible. Why? Because the conflict zone is bigger than the agreement zone. So, there's no way you can match up a yellow and a blue. There's 2 yellows and 1 blue. So there's just no way to sneak past them, all 3 of those states. Okay? So even with perfect secure communications, you still couldn't do it because they know that you're trying to get too much through them, so that would not work. Okay? Here's an example where it does work. It's a little bit askew here, but it's still working fine. In this example, it's very similar to what we just did. You'd pool together these outsiders, and then you would reveal the middle, and then you'd be in a good position to finish things up. Okay? So, but we twisted a little bit here, and now a subversive conversation is impossible. Why is that? Because the red zone is sort of shifting along here as x varies, or alternatively, you thought about it as y varies too, but thinking about it as x varies, the red zone's shifting here. So player 1 here really needs to know what player 2 thinks, okay, in order to make a right decision to coordinate. Okay, but to get it past the public, right, the problem with the public here is that they're very insensitive to these benefits. It's not rising along here, it's constant. So they can't sort of make a trade-off that they're able to make in other cases. Here you can trade off a yellow and a blue once you pool these 2 outside regions. But here there's no way to pool these guys, okay? So they can't find a partner in that is something they can pool with. So we can show that you can never have subversion in this class of situations. Here's another case where we can't possibly have subversion as well, okay? We can't match them up. So we're trying to make progress on that. That's getting kind of esoteric. That's like matching theory sort of stuff. And it goes way back to like the marriage problem of matching together, like 1920s, like men and women of different, prefer whatever and stuff like that. And here we're trying to match up the blues and the yellows. So it's tied to this old matching theory stuff. And we're trying to figure that out and how that's developed and stuff. So anyway, that's sort of a technical thing. We're trying to make some progress on that. But I think the bigger picture is, maybe it's kind of interesting that a back and forth conversation can play the role of a unbreakable code that the people are listening to you. They know exactly what you're saying and exactly what it means. Nevertheless, you're able to get what you want out of it. Okay? It requires that there's enough commonality of interest. Here, there's too much disagreement, so it would never work. Okay? But in a lot of situations, that can do it. So thinking about sort of careful conversations as a way to insulate from state apparatus or the dean figuring out what people are doing. Okay, so that's our general sort of plan, and we want to keep working on this, and seems like a new research topic within the limited range of what people do in our areas, and it's also it does seem to have it has this idea of conversations, which is a reason for conversations, which is cool, and maybe it has some connections to kind of things that people are doing. So does anybody have any questions?
Hey, no, Rick, thank you so much. First off, virtual round of applause. Really, really appreciate that. I know that's a lot to get through, and you did it very punctually. So no, we appreciate that. And that does leave us at least half an hour for discussion, which is fantastic. And we have Jamie up first to help us kick that off. And then following that, it looks like we have Deb and Jess so far. And I have to apologize. As you know, Rick, both of our resident, economist program directors have conflicts. But I know both Gustavo and Dean are going to be sending you comments offline. Great. So nice. sorry about that. So great. If you wouldn't mind, Jamie, feel free.
Sure. I really enjoyed your paper. This is really, really cool work that you're doing to think about this idea of subversive conversations. And it's kind of a question and an observation at the same time. I actually also got to just participate in a webinar last week that Vernon L. Smith gave, which was really cool. And he talked about how he got into experimental economics. And he said part of it was just doing classroom games. And he found that whenever he had his students trade in the classroom, that it took 3 trades. It took 3 rounds, and then they reached equilibrium. And then he tried that exact same experiment in other arenas and found the same thing, like this magic number of 3 rounds. So I'm really interested in this distinction between like the 3 rounds of trading versus like the 4 rounds of conversation, 4 rounds that maybe a subversive conversation would require. And it's not necessarily a question, but it's sort of, I'm trying to puzzle like why in one situation where people are communicating would we need 3 rounds, and in another would we need 4? And that may not be relevant to your research at all, but.
Okay. Well, do I answer one by one? Is that the plan usually, Scott? Yeah.
That's exactly right, Rick. Feel free.
So I don't know what Vernon Smith, what he was, thinking about a bit of a convergence there, a bit of a learning. I'm not sure exactly. I think it's, it's unfortunately, I think that this case is, not as robust as that. In that case, you think those models should converge pretty well. We don't really know much about robustness in the abstract of something like this. I sometimes feel like this conversation seems a little bit too careful. And maybe people in the mob or something know exactly what to say when. They always do in the movies, but it seems a little bit hard. So I'm very interested in this robustness question and trying to make some progress on that. But I'd love it if people really could converge on it in a few rounds. But I wouldn't be that clever, that's for sure.
No, that's great. Thank you, Rick.
With experience, a lot of experience, people who are used to being careful in their words, I can imagine this does have some insight into that, I hope.
Yep. Yeah, as you say, it's a balancing act between being bite-sized and, finding those policy implications. So thank you so much. And it looks like Deb, I think you're up next, who will also be our Colloquium speaker for next week. So thank you for joining us today as well, Deb.
Rick, you've really set a high bar. So I loved this presentation. I've never seen the conversation tree set up, and I think it's brilliant. I would love to learn a lot more about this modeling. It's really great. It's very, very clear, and it makes a lot of sense. Even to someone who doesn't is not familiar with this type of research. So it was really, really interesting to see that. Thank you. Yeah.
Last
And
slide.
it's aesthetic modeling, which is great. But I wanted to ask a question. I was really intrigued by what you said about something, and I can actually literally say it's outside of the box. And that was the issue of deniability. And I didn't see, I may have missed it, and be happy to understand where it fit in, how you take into account the deniability piece and whether there's a limit, or what the limit looks like on deniability, how many iterations of deniability before there's a lack of credibility. Again, this is a real externality probably, and you can talk about this much more accurately than I can, but at what point does the deniability piece influence the credibility of the actors and then influence the decision making? So that was number one. And then number two is the other piece that really intrigued me, because I come from the world of cyber stuff, is you hinted that there might be implications for cybersecurity. So I can't wait to hear what they are.
Okay, well, I'll take the second one first, since I was kind of hoping you would tell me what the implication. We don't really, we just have this vague sense that, like, it should be relevant. And we did go to this conference where there's computer scientists and everything, but I guess it was pretty early then. We didn't really know what we were doing. It didn't catch anyone's eye. So it does seem intriguing that you can have this back and forth aspect, which adds to the security level. In some abstract sense, the very exact sense here, it would not be possible to have a communication that got what you want unless it had the back and forth feature of it. And so, we wonder whether, maybe this is already known in computer science, like even our particular problem, maybe someone's done a variation in general version, entirely possible, So we're trying to, partly just figure out, oh no, is this anything that's been done? Don't tell the editors, it's under revision. No, we're worried about that, but we're also hopeful that it would give some new insight, So I do think it is kind of like, maybe if we're thinking about things that we're trying to find out, like, papers that might be enough relevant that we could follow a trail on. And, maybe this question of, maybe just the back and forth question, whether there's added security sometimes from a back and forth or something, maybe that would be a connection that we could follow that might lead to something. So any angles you have that would help us track down whether it's, part of a broader problem that people have done, or whether it's,
maybe we do this offline. I'm not, it's what really comes to mind is something completely out of my field. I'm a lawyer, but as you were speaking, the spark started flying off. This is how encryption people talk, with the handshakes and the verification of identities. And I think there's some great material that I'd be happy to send over and put you in contact with people. And that definitely goes to the issue of the credibility of the contact and in the outcome. So I think there's something here. It could be really interesting, actually.
And I think, it's only going to apply to cases where there is some commonality of interest, right? If it's all yellow and blue, or all yellow.
Yeah, Scott's shaking his head, so he's probably got a ton of things to add.
But real quick, on the deniability question, I think that gets to a weakness of this approach, is that a careful conversation is in itself a bit suspicious. So then, there are people who are very careful in their words. I'm certainly not one of them, but there are people I know, even our department, who've, dealt with administration stuff forever and everything, and every word they're careful about, and every letter that's written, and they don't diverge from that no matter what. So some context, it's just the way it is. It's suspicious, but here there's no uncertainty over the conflict of interest. That these managers might try to sneak by a dangerous project past you.
So no one's credible. No one's credible at the outset.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's but in reality, it's always a mix, and so there's certainly some lost credibility from being so careful.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great questions.
And I'll circle back and send you whatever I have.
Mm-hmm. That would be great, Deb. No, please do. And likewise, I don't want to monopolize either right now, Rick, but I think there's a lot of interesting linkages you could explore. I agree with the encryption piece, and I'll try to include a few sites in the chat box here in just a second as well, to kind of buttress that. And there's also a really important kind of subfield within internet governance and cybersecurity about the importance of information sharing and how to do that effectively. Okay. And the big debate is, frankly, whether you, okay, so just 30-second version. We have a very specific approach to this problem right now. So we're really good at having electric utilities talk to electric utilities and county, election officials talk to county election officials and DHS, but we're not very good at kind of breaking down those sectors and those barriers. So there's been a big debate for a while about whether you have a big tent approach to information sharing, which would be it's called information sharing and analysis organizations, or whether you get, frankly, government out of the equation and let the equivalent of, software engineers talk to software engineers really organically. And there's a lot of interesting studies that explore the benefits and drawbacks of both those approaches. But I could see that your results here, frankly, kind of speaking to that overarching debate, which frankly is only going to come to the fore again with the incoming Biden administration, because it was the Obama administration that was really out front pushing this kind of big tent approach to information sharing in the cyber context. So. Great. For what it's worth, it's policy relevant for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
So, and we can talk more about that. But like I said, I don't want to monopolize for now. But this is wonderful. So no, thank you, Deb. That was a great question, great discussion there. And it looks like, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Jess is next, and then I think we have Brian. And Lisa, if you wanted to expand on your comment in the chat box after that, I'll be happy to turn to you as well. But for now, Jess.
Great. Cool. Thanks. So I found this super interesting. Someone who's currently working on a disclosure model. It was really interesting to see. I had not seen a conversation tree either, so that was fascinating. My question is sort of twofold. One is, I'm not sure if it's a fair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And the other is more specific. Well, actually, I'm not sure either one's fair. I'm just going to go for it. First, I'm curious about whether you see this as addressing some sort of defined puzzle that was not yet thought through. You said it's like a sort of new area of research, but I'm just curious of were you observing a particular set of actors communicating and figuring out how they were solving this problem without having to come out and say exactly this thing that would be costly for them to say? Or in other words, how were you thinking about this as a broader problem when you approached this? Mm-hmm. My second question is more about the public, and that is, it seems to me you want to say that Cheap Talk has the capacity to essentially allow people to have conversations that essentially allow people to see what other people are not saying, right? So it's a way of communicating what you're not saying, right? Mm-hmm. Which is sort of one way of thinking about it. Mm-hmm. To me, you've modeled the public as sort of completely in the dark, right? In some of these cases, I would expect the sort of public or third observer to want to invest effort or some cost in actually understanding what the pooling options are, mm-hmm. right? What the possibilities, what the potential prior distribution of levels of conflict might be. And I'm curious whether you've considered extending it to think about whether there's a potentially informed or potentially driven to be informed public who might invest costs in trying to figure out what it is that they don't know, mm-hmm. right? With the idea being that they seem incredibly uninformed in this model, mm-hmm. right? And uninterested in knowing what they don't know. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, right, about how much they would want to know about what the unknowns are. And if you could think about a way to incorporate that, or if it's not of interest, that's fine. There's a lot of stuff already going on.
Mm-hmm. Great. So one way to think about that, there's two ways to think about it, I think. One is to think about that they acquire some information which helps them understand, the general situation, which is the same, which is a subset of the information maybe that the other guys have. That's not even what I want to say. That they learn information. It's known that they learn that information. Okay, so then this distribution has shifted. Okay, So they might want, we start out with this, this is actually a uniform example here, right? So we start with a uniform distribution. And so they're able to find out that it's, not uniform and find out more details, and the shape has changed a lot, right? And so what kind of shape would they like? And is it worth it for them to invest in that? That's a great question. So that would be one thing, but they keep up the common knowledge that, after they find that out, that it's known that they know that. The other, and that's a little complicated here because I have the two managers knowing different things. So as I think about that, I'm not sure how that would work out, but it definitely seems important. And the other one is whether they have their own sort of private signal. That would be informed receiver. So receiver has their own signal, and that's in a lot of these games. That's I've worked with some of those games, and that's can change things a lot. So I think that would probably be problematic, is my guess. So I have to think about that. Those are already complicated in regular, like one sender, one receiver models. And now we have the two senders here who are communicating with each other and everything. So I don't know how it's going to play out. This does, but that's like a great question.
I should say, having tried and failed to design a two-sender model.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
totally got it.
Yeah. So then another thing is sort of getting back a little bit to the more mechanism design-ish approach, which is not, I've always worked in cheap talk models, but where the receiver is basically going to set up a structure and force these guys to fess up, and by only allowing them to say certain messages and rewarding them and punishing them for different messages and such. And that's a whole nother level of commitment and everything. So appropriate in some situations, but not so much in others. So that people are asking us about that, and we're I think we'll address that. I don't know if we don't want to get, it's a lot. We're not sure what directions we're going to go. We have a lot of stuff that's not in the paper and everything. And I mean, it's fun, but do we want to do this forever? I don't know. Yeah. So anyway, good. But getting back to how it started, actually, I think it was really MacArthur Archishman. We've been working on this multi-dimensional cheap talk stuff for a while, and then he was working on something with a two different sender game within a Crawford Syllable environment, and he was doing it where they have different biases, and then he was kind of curious about and he started thinking about the going to zero bias, and then the other two of us jumped in. So it was he got it started, and I think it was because
a link to that paper in the chat.
Sure. Yeah. There's in the paper. If you look under Chakraborty in here, there should.
Oh, it's already there. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, with Bill Gay Olmaz.
Okay.
I think that's the one. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jess. Oh yeah, and thanks Devin for that as well. And then it looks like Brian, and then Lisa, if you'd like to chime in after that, you're welcome to.
Okay, and this kind of overlaps with some of what Jess has raised and some of your answers. So it could be more like a comment. But coming from irrigation, the perpetual problem with irrigation projects is that the proponents and their experts tend to overestimate the costs and overestimate the benefits and underestimate the costs. And so it looks like this paper is much more written from the side of the experts and how can we game this system. And I'd kind of side with the people of, okay, let's think about it from the other side of how to cope with biased experts. And just again, to connect with Jess, on my level as a citizen, I'm actually involved in a kind of coalition against a maglev rail transport project. And this problem of information, we happen to be lucky enough to have a retired engineer who helped develop safety standards. So on the safety standards, okay, we've got some real expertise. On the economic side, we don't necessarily have that. So it's this challenge of, how can we do this? And this comes more into institutional design, mechanism design. The question I kind of framed and is in the chat is, to what extent would this work suggest a need for new remedies or show how some of the old remedies are useful? You're clearly showing some limits on full disclosure if people are careful never to get it in an email, but other things like due diligence, that you have to look at the downside of a project, or fiduciary duty, that you can't shut your eyes and, oh, don't tell me about torture and corruption. These kind of principles we have are some of them relevant, or again, is there some need to think about other approaches? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, that does fit in well with what Jess was saying about, setting up from the other perspective and how to what you can do to stop this. And we thought about a little bit. It's we're just starting this project, and whether this model ends up being a robust sort of insight into this is still kind of up in the air and everything, right? There's a lot of other things going on that are probably could be more first order than this. But it's interesting, and it might turn out to be. So we're working on it. It seems like that you do need to. We were talking about maybe about sunshine laws and stuff like that, and does this offer insight into that? And finding a little bit pessimistically that you can sort of work around them if you're clever enough. So then we're thinking about that, especially like we're thinking about hiring committees, especially is a very relevant, question about whether their deliberations are reflecting their own biases about who they want to hire and stuff, and how they could be structured. So maybe, restrictions on the kind of communication would definitely work here, whether that's, practical or not, or important or not in the bigger scheme of things. But that's one way to think about it. It might be tying into a little bit what you were saying or not. Due diligence also in this model, they kind of give up, right? Because they know they're going to be that they're not going to find anything, so they don't even have really that much incentive to pay attention, because it's like they're not going to find out anything if they're careful. So I think that's a bit of a realistic concern too. That when maybe not because of this model, but in general, if people are being careful, it's even if you're due diligence, then you're not going to find as much. So that's the key question in all of this exactly, is now that we've just established that they can get this thing past the receiver here, what can the receiver do to stop that? And that is you guys are both right. That's exactly where research has to go.
Okay. Just a quick follow-up in the practical environmental impact assessment situation. Yeah, the key point, because if you can catch them that they've neglected something or withheld or concealed, all of a sudden that's a basis you can go to court and at least drag out the project a lot longer.
And to get back to this cheap talk sort of thing, that we've modeled this as a cheap talk game, but it would also hold if it was selective disclosure of verifiable information. So it could also be done as a disclosure game for most of these cases. So that's a little bit closer to what you were saying, that they're not just babbling about something, but there's some actual facts that come out. So if they selectively reveal facts, then we could have the same sort of process. And we just did it from cheap talk because that's what we do. But I wonder why we chose to do that, because most of the world does disclosure. So we probably should have done it as a disclosure game, because the same thing works.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Brian. And just to publicly recognize Brian briefly, he was the one who really put forward some great suggestions to revise the Colloquium series format, as you guys saw in the announcement. So thank you for that, Brian. And just as a reminder, we'll be implementing those starting in the spring with our new series. And keep those suggestions coming, okay? We really appreciate it. And then Lisa, who kindly kicked off the Ostrom Book Club not too long ago. Did you want to expand on that chat box comment as well?
Well, first of all, thank you for letting us be the first in the Ostrom Book Club. It was hugely fun and wonderful. And this is also hugely fun, depressing, but fun. So the reason it's a little depressing is because my research focus lately has been rules on paper and rules in use in terms of intrastate preemption. And I was on a mayor's summit that Ball State was doing for Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, which is our equivalent of the National League of Cities for Indiana, and learned that the FCC had passed a regulation that essentially preempts local government action and state government action in connection with the rollout of the 5G network and all the construction and installation of structures that are required for that. Basically gives the communication companies absolute power. And there are these very short time limits for they're authorized to apply basically for a community-wide permit. There's like 10-day limits and ultimately 90-day limits for the community, the municipality to respond, but it cannot respond by exercising any rights it has in public easement property. It can't say no, basically. It can't control the actual placement. It can't do any public health. It can't, there's no information, right? And the other thing we found in Indiana, as part of a project I'm part of that we got funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for, my piece of it again is preemption, is in Indiana under the Sunshine Law, or the open door laws it's called in Indiana. Police departments have absolute power not to disclose anything about police use of force. And we don't have any accountability effectively because that state law preempts local action.
Yeah, I think if we were thinking more of a disclosure game, then I think that would tie in very well your comment with the other ones, that these requirements on disclosure would work in this context. Finding out whether they disclose or not, I guess, is probably always the key in this context. So,
well, it's also it's also this curriculum problem for professional schools and graduate education, because negotiation is not required curriculum pretty much in any MPA program. And I don't believe it's required curriculum in the business school either, but correct me if I'm wrong. I always thought Steve Hayford's classes were electives.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it depends on the program. That's right. No, great points. Great points, Lisa. And Rick, we're pretty much unfortunately out of time here. So I'm not sure if you had any kind of final kind of reflections or thoughts. The only other one I wanted to add was, I think this cheap, the cheap talk or whatever format, and just kind of pivoting toward disclosure, I wouldn't worry about it too much. But in the context of cybersecurity in particular, I've done a little bit of work on, and this is building off of Lynn's work in particular, about how you open up those channels of communications and build that trust as being really fundamental to the success of especially these small clubs, even at the international level, these kind of mini-lateral groups. We've done some stuff with the Arctic Council to show how that kind of works in practice. So it's not cheap. In other words, really, it's foundational, talk. And I think that can be important to point to really kind of get the ball rolling here. So I'm happy to talk more about that too. But did you have any final reflections or comments on the way out here?
Well, these are really helpful comments. I think that I just the cybersecurity angle, that's going to give me some great angles, and I think people are right to push us towards the receiver side, how they can change this. I guess I thought I would use this occasion to read up more on Lynn Ostrom's work, and so I would be able to connect things better. But one always has plans like that, and so I know it some, but not very well. So if there's ways that it could be tied in a little bit better with this decentralization angle, seems to be there as well. So if people have any thoughts on that, then if you could send me, then I think it'd be nice for the paper and make me personally happy if there was if I finally did something that was could connect to all the great stuff that she has done. So.
Oh, absolutely. I think you're going to find a lot of connections, maybe too many. Polycentric governance and complexity theory come to mind immediately. And we're working on revamping the Ostrom teaching page, which is going to have a lot of resources and some short webinars and various guides for researchers, but also frankly pedagogical resources to bring in the Ostrom tradition more into the classroom. So I'll send out a link to what we have so far, but just know that more of that is coming, and the Ostrom fellows are doing a great job helping us with that for their group service learning project this year. So yeah, echoing Jess there in the chat box. Thank you, Rick. That was just fantastic. One more virtual round of applause. We really appreciate it. Thank you. And one final reminder as well, besides all the other events this week, we do have a session that Angie is moderating at 2:00 today, which is on the COVID-19 pandemic and some responses to governance that it's engendering from a lot of different perspectives. And I think that one is co-sponsored, correct me if I'm wrong, Angie, with the IASC, with the International Association for the Study of the Commons. So that's at 2:00 today. So if you're still a glutton for punishment, join us for that in an hour. We look forward to it. So hope to see many of you either physically or virtually on Thursday as well for the statue dedication. Thanks so much again, Rick. I really appreciate it.
Thank you guys.
Take care, everybody.